Seeking military intervention in Yemen, the country's embattled president appeals for willing countries to combat rebels he says are backed by Iran, raising the specter of a Saudi response. On Inside Story, is Yemen on the brink of a wider war? Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen AbughaidaGuests. It's a battleground fraught with opposing forces and competing interests, a country wavering between dialogue and diplomacy and military escalation, torn by loyalties to presidents past and present. All the while, Yemen remains in the shadows of powerful neighbours who are seeking to influence events on the ground, complicated further by the presence of Al-Qaeda and ISIL. In the midst of this turmoil, Shia Houthi rebels have pushed the government from power after months of fighting, driving President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi first from the capital Sanaa and now from where he had taken refuge in the southern port city of Aden. Well, Hadi has appealed to Gulf neighbours for military assistance to stem the Houthi advance. And Saudi Arabia saying if a peaceful resolution cannot be found, it will take what it calls necessary measures to protect the region. Brinkmanship or battle cries as the UN holds out hope of further talks between rival factions here in Doha. We'll get the thoughts of our guests in a moment after we hear from Al Jazeera's Emike Umulu.
It's shocked many people that Houthis have advanced this far south, Taiz, Yemen's third largest city, especially the locals. Every day this week, they've taken a stand, chanting for the rebels to leave.
We swear that we'll drive out all Houthis from Taiz and teach them a lesson they'll never forget.
Houthi fighters replied with gunfire and tear gas. Several people were killed, many more injured. Paramedics say some of the shooters wore police uniforms. Other reports say the internal security officers themselves, the ones meant to be keeping the peace, have joined the Houthis. These forces are said to be loyal to Yemen's long-time ruler Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was ousted in the recent uprising and now appears to be backing the Houthis. People here are no longer sure who they can trust. The Houthi rebel group has morphed from a small armed unit fighting for more government jobs and autonomy into a larger force. In September, it took over the capital Sanaa. President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi escaped to Aden in the south. Saudi Arabia has sent soldiers to protect its border with Yemen. The Saudi foreign minister had this to say.
We hope that this can be done peacefully. But if it's not done peacefully, certainly the countries of the region and the Arab will take the necessary measures to protect the region from their aggression.
Right now, the Houthis are fanning out across the country. They insist they're fighting for a fair distribution of wealth for everyone, not just Shias or their own Zaydi community. These people in the south aren't taking any chances. They're grouping in large numbers with guns, tanks, and ammunition. This crisis appears far more political than it is religious or even tribal, and very fragmented. Emike Umulu for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests to discuss this. Here in Doha, we have with us Abdullah Baabood. He's the director of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University. In London, Steven Zyck is author of the book Mediating Transition in Yemen, Achievements and Lessons. Over in Washington, D.C., we're joined by Gordon Lubold. He's a senior military writer at Defense One. And Gordon has also worked with the United States Institute of Peace. Thank you very much for joining us all on Inside Story. Abdullah, so when Saudi Arabia says they will take all necessary measures to protect the region, and there are reports of a military buildup along the border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, what is the message that's being sent?
I think Saudi Arabia is sending more than one message. It's sending a message to the rebels, to the Houthis, that they have to start finding and helping to find a peace settlement to the problem. Sending a message to the United Nations and the UN Security Council that they have to act reasonably and responsibly on this issue. Sending a message to Iran that it cannot continue to support these Houthi rebels, and that the Gulf states will try and find out ways of protecting themselves. Now, if we are talking and thinking that this is going to be an intervention, like sending the Gulf Peninsula shield that happened in Bahrain, I don't think this is going to happen. But I think the Gulf states will try and find different measures through UN Security Council and through supporting some proxies. But what we are really looking at...
But why have measures not been found previous to this, prior to the situation that Yemen finds itself in now?
This is a very good question, and I think many people do ask that. And I believe that the Gulf states have failed to understand what was going on in Yemen. They came up with the Yemen initiative, but they did not follow on with that initiative to continue to ensure its success. And also the international community has failed to deliver on the promises and the pledges that they have done to help Yemen to transit into a more stable country and vibrant economy. So I think the Gulf states also bear some responsibilities here. We've had crises in the Gulf, as you know, where the Gulf states were not talking to each other for a while. There was not a collective GCC policy, and in some ways divergent policies where one Gulf state is supporting one group against the other. So I think it is something to also, the fault line also lays within the Gulf states.
Stephen, in your opinion, what are the necessary measures that Saudi Arabia talks about here? And also this situation on the border with these reports of the Saudi troops amassing on the border, can that exacerbate the situation?
Absolutely. So the situation on the ground is one in which the Saudis are using the military buildup and the threats of further military buildup and the very real threats of a military intervention of some sort as a means of really pushing the Houthis towards the negotiating table. Now, what we primarily hear is that the largest portion of this buildup is taking place in Jazan in Saudi Arabia, which is near the Houthis' home base and traditional stronghold in Sanaa. And this is a signal to the Houthis that while the Saudis may be unable to necessarily attack them in Taiz and in Aden and in other cities, that they could threaten the Houthis' traditional base and therefore signal the urgency with which the Houthis need to treat the proposed negotiations in Doha next week.
Gordon, your opinion on the troops, is this sort of a defensive move on the part of Saudi Arabia, or is it possibly plans for a future ground invasion?
You know, I think it would be a little premature to suggest that Saudi Arabia is going to mount a ground invasion, but certainly you've got one of the richest countries pitted right next door to one of the poorest, and with all this instability, Saudi Arabia clearly has serious concerns, as the other guests have noted. But I think that that's a great kind of opening move to set the stage for as he said, the negotiations that should start next week in Doha.
So how would you, Gordon, expect the Houthis then to respond to this now?
Well, I think that, you know, they'll have to heed what Saudi Arabia is doing, but you know, they've clearly made a lot of inroads. They're marching south. The president has apparently left the country. I think that they've achieved some momentum, more momentum, and you know, I think it would take something more than what we're seeing now to get them to kind of stop.
So would you say they are going into the negotiations with the upper hand, really?
Well, they definitely have some hand. They definitely have somewhat of an upper hand right now. But whether that's going to you know, keep them afloat for very long, we don't know.
Abdullah, what do you think about the negotiations and how the Houthis are entering them? And also, what would be the ultimate goal of the GCC here? Is it to ward off the Houthi advance, or is it another message perhaps to Iran?
Well, Yemen is a very important strategic neighboring country to the GCC states. the stability and the prosperity of Yemen is very important to the Gulf states and the Arabian Peninsula. We cannot live in peace in the Gulf if Yemen is not peaceful. So it is strategically important that the Gulf states try and find a solution to what is going on in Yemen. Given their past mistakes and past failures, I think the Gulf states is now, they've been rudely awakened by what al-Houthi have done. But al-Houthi cannot control a country as fast as Yemen. They are a minority within the country. There are still the tribes.
Yet they have made significant gains recently.
Tactically they have, but how long can they continue to hold the country? How long can they continue to spend on the country? Iran, their supporter, is also economically suffering. And the Yemenis will not just succumb to al-Houthis' pressure. There will be a civil war, there will be proxy war, there will be regional war in Yemen. And I think the Houthis know this, and they are also very careful on how far they want to go. And I feel that they would want to have a peaceful resolution to the conflict. It's definitely a situation where they cannot just win. It's a situation where there have to be a win-win situation. And the Gulf states have a very important role here to play. Not necessarily militarily, but definitely economically and politically. And I believe that the Gulf states have now been awakened to this. And the fact that the talks are going to happen in Doha is a sign that there is serious talks, because initially it was mentioned that it was going to be in Riyadh. And it was moved because I think the Houthis had objected to Riyadh. And Doha is seen by them as a place where they can perhaps have talks. Also, Doha have had history in holding talks between Yemeni rebel factions and have been successful. So I think there is a lot of hopes have been pinned on the talks in Doha. No one is going to win this war, not Iran, not Saudi Arabia, not the Houthis, and not the other factions, and Abd Rabbu Mansour. Has to be
Just back to the military angle for a second, Abdullah, and your opinion on what's at stake for Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries themselves if they do intervene militarily.
Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries do not have the military capability to intervene militarily in Yemen. They have been amassing a lot of weapons, as people know, in terms of very sophisticated weapons that have been brought to the Gulf states. But they lack the human resources to be able to deliver and to win a war in Yemen. Yemen has been...
And it is a very difficult terrain.
It's a difficult terrain where many countries and many civilizations have lost wars in Yemen. The Ottoman Turks, the Egyptians, and the British before them have lost wars in Yemen. Yemen is a very difficult country to control, and I don't think anybody is going to risk sending ground troops. If there is going to be a Gulf intervention, if at all, it will have to be by air. It will have to be airstrikes, coordinated airstrikes, but it will have to be under some kind of United Nations Security Council resolution. But I don't think any country in the Gulf states will risk sending troops to Yemen.
Well, when the Houthis rebelled against the Yemeni government in 2004, leaders said they were defending their community. They were also protesting against discrimination. They say they were marginalized both politically as well as economically. Their demands grew to include calls for government accountability, an end to corruption, and more job opportunities. Houthis took part in the 2011 revolution, but hopes for political reforms were not realized, and the group signed the Peace and National Partnership Agreement in September after gaining control of Sanaa, agreeing to the terms of a new government and prime minister, but refusing to lay down their arms. That process stalled, and in January, rebels overran President Hadi's palace, demanding a power-sharing deal, while rejecting a draft constitution that divides Yemen into 6 federal regions. So what do the rebels actually want right now? Let me put that to Stephen in London.
The Houthis are currently developing their own strategy. The Houthis, over the years, it's never been entirely clear what their objectives are going into any peace process, any conflict, any negotiation. And that's always been one of the Houthis' greatest weaknesses, is they do not have that strategic planning. And that's, in fact, one of the risks that they are going to face going into the negotiations in Doha, is the fact that they are not very good at clearly articulating exactly what it is that they are seeking. And this was something that particularly hurt them during the national dialogue process and the broader transition process after the departure of former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, where the Houthis participated in the negotiations but simply weren't as ready as the other participants to defend their interests. So it's difficult to say. However, as you rightly noted, the Houthis have long sought a degree of autonomy and a degree of respect within Yemen for their place within the country, within its state, within its economy, and within its history. And one of the reasons that the Houthis have decided to launch this latest offensive in recent months is the fact that they increasingly feel under threat from opposition parties, from very conservative Sunni groups, some of them supported by other countries in the region, and that they feel that their role within Yemen and that their basic safety was under threat. So they want to get to a position where they feel that their place within Yemen is safe and secured, and that they have the ability to control certain parts of Yemen where they have traditionally had a strong base.
And they certainly have the backing of the former president, Stephen, Ali Abdullah Saleh.
Yes, it's absolutely very difficult to talk about the Houthis as in fact the driving force behind the current situation in Yemen, because the Houthis would not have nearly as much military capability. They wouldn't have the ability to take over and hold the capital and Taiz and Aden without the backing of the former president and the significant portion of the country's armed forces and internal security services that he controls.
Well, it's a very complex picture on the ground in Yemen, as you're hearing, with support for and against most of the players involved. We've been talking about forces loyal to President Hadi consist of army units and tribesmen and locally recruited militia known as Popular Resistance Committees. And entire units, though, are said to have defected to join the Shia or Houthi rebels. Well, they're fighting alongside forces loyal to the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Then there's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, considered by the U.S. to be the group's most dangerous. And more recently, a group known as Sanaa province, which is claiming affiliation to ISIL in Syria as well as in Iraq. Gordon, talking about alliances, how much support does Saleh, the former president, have among the Yemeni military at this point?
I think that's a little unclear. Clearly, he's shoring up some support, clearly within the Houthi community. But the military, I think that the point I would make about how much we can see what's going on inside the country has been dramatically limited by the American withdrawal of its military over the weekend. That, you know, the diplomatic corps left recently when the closure of the U.S. embassy, but the U.S. military then drew its I think 125 or so special forces personnel out over the weekend. That means for the U.S.
Did the U.S. withdraw in anticipation of this area and this airbase that recently fell close to Aden? Did they withdraw in anticipation of it falling?
I think it's clear that they saw the writing on the wall, that this was becoming an unstable and untenable situation for these forces, which, as you know, are like the kind of high-end, top-shelf, you know, forces in terms of capability for the U.S. military. They were doing training, but they were also doing, you know, helping to call in whatever airstrikes might have occurred against AQAP, which, as you noted, you know, is seen as one of the most lethal affiliates of Al-Qaeda.
Right. So how does this withdrawal actually affect the fight against Al-Qaeda in Yemen?
Well, I think that we've seen in other places where Al-Qaeda, you know, takes advantage of the chaos wherever they are. And I don't know that we've seen immediate signs of that now over the last few days, but I think it's clear that the concern the U.S. is going to have, given that their primary interest in Yemen was this counterterrorism mission against AQAP, you know, is now in peril, because they really don't know what's happening on the ground and what AQAP might be planning. But it's clear that the turmoil is a good thing for AQAP.
You know, Hadi's administration in Yemen has accused military figures who are loyal to the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, as well as the Houthis, of staging a failed coup attempt, and they've branded them as Iran's agents. That's what they're saying. Let me ask you about the government in Iran and how strategic it sees Yemen is to it.
Well, the government in Iran has a much larger strategy than Yemen. So you can see the government in Iran has moved to and now fighting a war in Baghdad, in Iraq. And they are also, as you know, they're supporting the Syrian president against the rebellions there. The government of Iran also has its arms with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Government of Iran also is trying to make links either with Hamas or other organizations in Palestine. And Al-Houthi group, they had been some contacts with Iran, and they had some affiliation and some relationship with Iran. But Iran is upping the ante against the Gulf states. It's really surrounding the Gulf states from all different aspects. From the north, you have Iraq and Syria. From the south, you have Yemen. So as long they're doing this, at the same time continuing with the nuclear negotiations. Basically, they're trying to win as many cards as possible that they can put on the table, and to say that to the people as five, we have the files, we are the key for security and for stability in the region. Without us, you cannot talk about security and stability in the region. Iran is playing a very dangerous game here. I think they're overextending their power. They're trying to bite more than they can swallow. And this is really dangerous. It's also inspiring sectarian war and sectarian conflict. The Iranian intervention, whether it is in Iraq, whether it's in Yemen or Syria, is also inspiring young people to join people like Al-Qaeda or now ISIL. So,
Stephen, Abdullah sounding like he's pretty certain that there is a direct intervention from Iran when it comes to Yemen. Is that something that you agree with? And how do you view this issue that this is in fact a proxy war between Iran and some of the Gulf states?
First, I think it's important to acknowledge that the evidence base for Iran's involvement in Yemen and in the current situation in Yemen is very weak. We understand that there are some linkages between senior Houthi figures and Iran. We know that certain Houthi leaders have also converted from the Zaidi branch of Shia Islam that's practiced among the Houthis to Twelver Shia, the Iranian variety. However, there is only very little evidence of direct Iranian support to the Houthis in terms of weaponry and fighters. The reports are sketchy, and I think it's far too early to conclude that Iran is actually playing a major role in the conflict, because the Houthis' military strength is primarily derived from the former president and his allies in the military. And had Iran been involved, this would be a much larger war on a much larger scale. And to some extent, I do feel that certain countries in the Gulf are exaggerating the threat of Iranian involvement to help ensure that the battle against the Houthis is something that is given high priority in Western capitals, particularly in Washington.
Gordon, is that a viewpoint that you agree with? And also just tell us how you see this playing out over the near short term.
You know, I think it is, I think I would double or agree that what support Iran is directly giving to the Houthis right now is a little unclear. They have their own issues, and I think from what I know or what I can tell, other people see that, you know, the support has been slow to come to the Houthis and just isn't all that direct. And I don't know that Yemen is a strategic priority for Iran either. You know, I think the next big step obviously will be these talks in Doha, and I think if they achieve one thing, it will be to kind of settle everything and to kind of freeze it for the moment, because as the U.S. military likes to say, the situation is very fluid. The stability is so has dropped so far that I think that the first thing that talks could do is to kind of bring everybody to the table and get us some sense of where the next steps lie.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us over in London. We had Steven Zyck. In Washington, Gordon Lubold, thank you. And Abdullah Baabood, we appreciate your time with us on Inside Story. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for watching. If you have anything to add, you can go to our program page at Jazeera.com. You can post your comments on Facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can even tweet us at AJ Inside Story. I'm Dareen AbughaidaGuests from the whole team here in Doha. Bye-bye for now.